Just wait for the recording to start. Okay, perfect. And we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is the last session of our three-part webinar series. In case you already had the chance to participate before, it's called the Decolonization webinar series, which had the main purpose to explore and unpack both justice-oriented approaches and decolonial approaches in the field of climate mobilities and immobilities. As you can see from the first slide, the title of this webinar is Transforming Policy, Decolonial Approaches to Climate Mobility Governance. So in a way already, the title speaks to itself. We are focusing right now on alternatives to the traditional and oftentimes top-down approaches when it comes also on a policy level. So we're trying to look at alternatives, especially following along a more decolonial and critical lens when we talk and we refer to address climate mobility governance as a specific topic. Before continuing with the presentation of our webinar and especially the presentation of our speakers, I would like to first present myself. My name is Cosimo Bianchi, and I'm part of the climate mobility team of the Migration, Youth and Children platform. And in case you didn't know this organization before, it's basically the migration constituency of the major group for children and youth, which is basically the self-independent space and formal space for youth and children to participate in allied policies as well as intergovernmental processes at the United Nations and beyond the United Nations. I will be today's moderator for the webinar, but of course behind this work there is the rest of the team, which I would like to of course present. So we do have Stefano Olivieri, who is our climate mobility lead, who also is going to be more our technical officer, let's say, also in this regards, because she's going to take care also of all technical and logistical issues. So feel free to refer to her if you are experiencing any problems during the webinar. But then we also have, of course, Teja Petty, Asana Bib Simon, and Seka Joan Blaise, who are also part of the climate mobility team. To continue, I would just like to briefly walk you through the webinar's agenda. So today's agenda, we will basically provide a set of this introduction, provide a brief overview of the webinar series, and especially give you just some brief insights of what has happened in the previous two webinars. Then, of course, we will focus on our third webinar, the last one, and reflect together why it's important to move beyond traditional climate mobility policies in order to, of course, lead towards more justice-oriented approaches, but by specifically focusing on decolonial lenses and approaches. There will be, of course, the most important part, which is the speakers' presentations. We have 4 speakers today, and I would be able to present them to you later. Of course, there will be a Q&A session for you participant to ask any questions or pressing questions that you have after the speaker's presentation. And then, of course, some closing statement and also some next steps for what can come after this webinar series. Just to also provide you in this following slide, I will just give you some general guidelines for today's webinar. So, of course, it would be nice to, if you could also show your face in the camera, but feel free to be to do whatever makes you feel more comfortable. Of course, it would be easier if there are also like the name and in some cases also the pronouns, so it would be easier to refer to you, especially participants during the discussion. Please keep also your microphone muted, especially when the speaker speaks, so it will be easier to hear also what the speakers or the participants might be able to say during the webinar series. Please also use the raise hand feature here on Zoom. Also, it would be easier in this case to refer to the person that would like to speak. And please, in general, it would be very important to keep like a respectful atmosphere. This is something we always like to enforce and emphasize. Of course, we are challenging ourselves in this webinar. We are talking about difficult topics, and we might also have different viewpoints, but it's important to always find a way to find a respectful atmosphere during this discussion. And of course, as already mentioned, Stefano Olivieri is our more technical officer also in this specific case, so feel free to refer to her again if you have any issues, as I mentioned before. But now we can actually start with the webinar itself. Just to provide a brief overview, of course, as I mentioned, this webinar is called the Colonization Webinar Series. It is a three-part webinar series, which had the overall purpose to address the colonial insights as well as practices, justice-oriented practices in the field of climate mobilities and mobilities. So especially when we talk about climate-related displacement and migration, oftentimes in the media, but in some cases also in academic settings, we tend to overhear the aspects related to climate change hazards, environmental hazards, but oftentimes we forget to reflect on other important issues, such as reflecting on socioeconomic vulnerabilities, political, legal, infrastructural vulnerabilities, which further contribute to these forms of climate-related displacement and migration. And especially we would like also, by following on the colonial lens, to reflect also on the colonial histories, power imbalances, as well as systemic injustices, which further contribute to the issues and challenges related to climate mobilities and immobilities. But also, just to give you an overview, we already had two other webinars previous to this one. And the first one had the purpose to address climate mobilities approaches, especially the colonial approaches, from a more scholarly lens. So we also invited more scholars and researchers which are specifically focusing on the colonial lenses in the field of climate mobility and immobility, while the second webinar focused more on bringing attention to youth voices and youth advocates in this specific sector. While this is actually a webinar which would have in this specific case more speakers, there will be 4 speakers, all from different backgrounds, not only cultural speaking, but also like on a workplace level, but all people that are interested, of course, to work in the field of climate mobility. And we will be focusing on the role of policymaking and how can we critically examine policies in this field of climate mobility governance. Just another slide, just to provide, of course, the name of today's webinar. As I already said, is called Transforming Policy, the Colonial Approaches to Climate Mobility Governance. And as you can see, of course, our main goal is not only to explore the shortcomings and the limitations in nowadays and traditional policies in the field of climate mobilities, but we also and especially want to address alternatives to these policies, to these traditional policies that are often top-down policies when it comes to address climate mobility challenges and issues. So this is more from my side. I would just like to present our 4 speakers and then finally give the floor to our amazing speakers that had the chance to voluntarily participate in today's webinar. So I would like to thank you again to all of you to participate in today's event. So just to start off, we do have Kgaugelo Mkumbeni, who has dedicated a career to advocating for climate action and sustainable development through engaging in policy processes, research, and advisory roles. She currently works as a research officer at the Institute for Security Studies in the Climate Risk and Human Security Project. Kgaugelo holds a Bachelor of Science with honors in political and international studies from Rhodes University. She's currently pursuing a Master in Security Studies at the University of Pretoria. She has also worked in the youth program at the South African Institute of International Affairs in the Climate Youth Policy Committee. She is a former head delegate of South Africa at the Y20. Kgaugelo also has served as a member of the Southern African Development Community Youth Parliament. She has also negotiated for South Africa for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, working with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment. And she's also a member of the Youth Leaders Caucus of the Presidential Climate Commission. To follow, we have Dr. Andrea Simonelli, who is an associate professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University and founder of Adaptation Strategies International. She's a consultant for IOM, a member of Environmental and Climate Mobilities Network, and the Academics for Climate Advocacy Working Group. She is also speaker for the Climate Voices Network, sits on the roster of experts for the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, is a member of the UNFCCC Research and independent non-governmental organizations to the United Nations Framework Conventions on Climate Change, a member of the Earth System Law Task Force, and serves on the board of directors for the National Transparency Project. Her research investigates the global governance implication of climate mobilities, as well as the relationship between governance, adaptation, and local resilience in the Maldives, as well as in the Pacific Island states. To follow, we do have Kuta Joseph, who is a proud son of Brotuma and Banaba, dedicated to climate advocacy and youth empowerment. He is the co-founder of the Pacific Climate Custodians and the visionary behind the Pacific Youth Platform. He holds a dual degree with a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and a Bachelor of Science in Animal Husbandry, with a dynamic presence as a mover, shaker, and multilingual communicator. Recently, Kuta played a pivotal role in negotiating engagement terms with the Global Loss and Damage Youth Coalition, serves as a representative to MYCP, and contributes as an active executive in the Pacific Migration Partners. A passionate human rights activist committed to linking the devastation of its ancestral homeland to loss and damage, while championing advocacy for relocation, mining, and other pressing issues affecting displaced communities. He has represented his people at various levels, wearing different hats to amplify the voices of the grassroots communities and sharing the Padaman stories and a messenger of the Pacific. And to conclude, we have Frimpong Nyarko, who is a researcher with international experience in the multi-level governance of climate change and human mobility. Frimpong originally comes from Ghana, but he moved to the Netherlands for his graduate studies at Wageningen University. Afterwards, he worked with IOM to support the displacement in South Sudan. He has also been working with Deltares to support the African Climate Mobility Initiative led by the Global Center for Climate Mobility. So as you can see, to our participants, as you can see, we have four incredible speakers specialized, especially in the field of climate mobility. So we have the big privilege to have different voices, and especially also from different cultures and different contexts. So I'm very happy to finally give the floor to our speakers. I will just give the floor first to Kgaugelo. Thank you for starting, and I will just first read out loud our first question that we prepare also for you guys to prepare. So there will be three questions just to let you know for the participants, and every speaker will work and speak and respond to each question. So the first one will be, what colonial legacies and power structures within the United Nations policy frameworks prevent climate-related harm from being recognized as persecution, and how do these barriers continue to silence the experiences of those most affected by climate mobilities and immobilities? So feel free to go whenever you want, and it's your time to shine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I would say the first thing is that there is a very Eurocentric foundation in the policy system itself. The international global policy system is one that perpetuates a legacy of Eurocentrism. And we see this in its formation, right? The formation of the system itself is one that is rooted in the 1951 Refugee Convention, which was crafted in the aftermath of World War II. Sorry, I'm going to give a history lesson, but it's very key to the point I'm making. And primarily to protect Western refugees. And the definition of persecution in this context is rooted in political, religious, but also very much civil rights orientated violations, which don't often include environmental or climate related causes. And what this means, the implication of this Eurocentric framing means that there is a prioritization of individual political persecution over collective structural harms like climate change, which disproportionately affect the global south. So in essence, we're seeing a dynamic where this framing and this foundation inadequately serves the global south. If anything, it does not serve the global south, especially a global south that bears the brunt of a climate crisis that it did very little to cause, right? And that climate crisis itself is a clear manifestation of the structural harm that a Eurocentric and Western system of policy has often struggled to reconcile and address. And as we may know, this climate crisis really threatens a wide array of human rights, from water to food to health to education. And in this definition, in this context, the term climate refugees is often used to describe people who have to flee from their homes because of climate-related disasters, right? And often need protection from an assistance in that way. And I think it's a very simple but very impactful phrase that speaks to the discussion of climate change and causing emergencies. But this is not a definition that is quite prominent in international law because of those foundations that I speak of. So it often limits our the inclusion of this non-Western experience in policy, right? My second point is that there is an erasure of the global south in decision making. And this erasure has meant that the UN system was created for nation states, right, that had influence initially, like US, France, for example. These are countries that are responsible for historic emissions primarily and disproportionately have power in decision making. And what we see is that these countries often resist the recognition of climate change as a driver of persecution. And I say persecution because it's the question you asked, right? Because essentially what it means is that these countries will then have to answer and have accountability measures, create moral and financial obligations like reparations that they are not willing to account for. And this is again the erasure and the dynamic that it creates. My third point is that there is a marginalization of indigenous and local systems. And I say local systems are not knowledge systems because they go beyond just knowledge. They are actually systems. And I speak of this as an erasure because it means that marginalized communities that have been affected by climate change have been removed from the conversation of policy. And oftentimes, even when they are mentioned as a sprinkle on the top, a cherry on top in policy. Oftentimes, the way in which we conduct policy processes is often very technical and quite bureaucratic. There is a lot of use of that kind of language, and it creates a barrier for communities that are most impacted by climate change. And these climate impacts in these communities are not understood in the same way that they are understood at the top level in the UN. They are understood as experiences through traditional knowledge, through seasonal patterns and spiritual relationships in some cases that often don't find place and don't effectively resonate in bureaucratic policy language. And this is a type of harm and dynamic that we don't really speak enough about because it's the climate harm that intricately interacts with identity, history, and displacement, essentially. And it's a prosecution that we need to start speaking more about, the erasure and marginalization of local and indigenous systems. I'll leave it there.
Thank you a lot, Kgaugelo, for already shedding lights on incredible points, especially when you talk about the marginalization of indigenous and local systems, which of course is not in line with this overused bureaucratic policy language. And of course, very good that you already mentioned important aspects as this overall Eurocentric approach, which is of course not only common when we talk about climate mobility, but just in general. But you already raised in a few minutes important points that I'm sure we will discuss over these questions and also in the following questions. I will just, because of a lack of time, I will immediately give the floor to Andrea, and so feel free to go, Andrea, whenever you want.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Had a few notes about some of the history, but I think our last speaker covered a few of those points for me, so that's good. It gives me a chance to move forward a little bit. I think the tricky part, partly with this, is the colonial legacy of persecution. While it's a historical concept that has Middle Eastern roots of thousands of years ago, has just been much more modernly associated with, as she was speaking, Europeans and European migrants and displacees, of course, from World War II, but more so, and World War I when this all started. But that persecution looks a very particular manner. And it does so because of the fact that it's sort of time bound in this little neat bow we put around it with the definition from the 1951 convention that persecution means a certain thing and it's from this era and then it was then eventually expanded on, but not by much. It was mostly historically changed with the extension of a time instead of what it means. So the idea of being persecuted for race, religion, and whatnot has come out of this just being extended, but not from different circumstances. So in terms of what we think about is the impact of climate change, it could be argued to be a persecution of the developed world, basically by the Western powers and their source of development. But because we're not thinking about it in that way, we have a specific legal definition. We're very much bound legally um, in international law by that, which creates a bit of a different complication. Um, and so it also limits intervention within nations if you haven't crossed an international border, because part of being persecuted isn't so much just that this terrible thing has happened and it has created a need for protection while I am moving in an acute sense, but that part of the definition is you have to cross international borders. So if I have not needed to cross an international border, but where I have left from isn't safe and where I arrive at isn't particularly safe, that is at the whim of the nation at hand and where this is occurring, which causes more problems because you have this sort of not just temporal, but localized element of having your government not be able to handle it. But of course, that's the idea of persecution by political means and not the sort of larger concept that I mentioned. Um, and of course, a lot of these pieces too are led by colonizers to begin with, right? So since the UN didn't come into existence and then automatically start taking on the persecution of their main members that they had inflicted on smaller members, that was never a piece of this. That I think the erasure that our last speaker was discussing sort of stems from this idea that, we move forward, but we didn't look back in saying, when we've created this system and human rights as initial members and taking this on, were we also inflicting past harm that we should atone for, or at least minimally try to manage for the future? And because that sort of, we have a starting point um, in the world wars and just didn't really look back into what those colonial legacies handed people in the first place, that the erasure was sort of easily sought, right? If we are looking forward and not actually trying to figure out if the principles we want to live by had been uh, implemented or should be toward the future. So I think part of the real difficult of the recognition of persecution is we're still sort of locked in a particular way that we view it. And over the course of my career, I've heard from UNHCR over and over again a parroted repetition of we're not going to extend this. Like, this is our definition, this is the legal definition, we're holding steady to it, and for multiple reasons, not just to be jerks per se of being stubborn, but because dealing with persecution itself is expensive and it requires a lot of people and energy, and protecting that is important, but also we haven't really extended into all the ways in which we could be thinking about future persecution and then funding that instead of just saying, it's expensive and we want to protect those who are most immediately in danger without realizing that the future of danger doesn't look like the past, and it's not going to. So I'll leave that there for our next speaker.
Thank you a lot, Andrea. Incredible also that you already discussed this important aspect of persecution, which should still be discussed every day when we talk about climate mobility governance. But there is definitely not clarity, especially that nowadays climate change is still not considered as a form of persecution, And of course, this enforces the idea that oftentimes climate disasters almost seems like natural disasters, but we all know it's not only like a natural cause. And this is often caused by also lack of understanding of defining persecution, or maybe simplifying the definition of persecution to a certain extent, as you were also like assuming, also like responding to with your response. So thank you also, Andrea, for your insights. I will just give the floor to Kuta directly. Feel free to go whenever you want.
Hello everyone. I'll just have about a 4 minutes personal story review of my people. So on this coming December 15, we will commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Banaban people relocation to Rambi Island in Fiji, a journey that begins in 1945. For generations, Banabans have borne the heavy burden of colonial resources extraction, forced displacement, and systematic silencing. My homeland, Banape, was stripped of its rich phosphate deposits to fuel foreign industries, leading to our forced relocation to Rambi Island in Fiji. This history of exploitation is not confined to the past. It continues to shape the injustice we face today, particularly in the context of climate displacement. The colonial legacy embedded in the UN policy framework still prevents climate-induced harm from being recognized as persecutions. For instance, the GCM framework has failed to acknowledge the forced displacement of indigenous and island communities caused by extractive industries, rising seas, and environmental degradation. All of these stems from historical power imbalance that have never been fully addressed. Instead, policy favors states' sovereignty over human rights, limiting legal recognitions and protection for those displaced by climate change. The Banaban experience reflects this reality. As the Banaban human rights defender, we usually highlight a quote, and I quote, "There is no justice without Banaban justice." We are uprooted not only by the physical destruction of our homeland, but by the erosions of our life, history in global policy discussion. The UN reluctance of frame climate-induced displacement as persecutions allows powerful nations often the greatest contribution to environment harm to evade responsibility. Instead of ensuring justice, these policies force displaced communities into a category of migrants rather than recognizing them as people forcibly displaced by the actions of others. This systematic silencing continues in international climate negotiations. Our voices are drowned out by bureaucratic structures designed to serve states' interests rather than frontline communities. Solutions are dictated to us rather than shaped by our leaders. Those of us advocating for recognition and restitutions are dismissed, while our histories of displacement, survival, and resistance are rendered invisible in legal and diplomatic discussions. If climate justice is to be meaningful, it must dismantle these colonial frameworks that enable ongoing persecutions. Our displacement is not a passive circumstances. It is the direct result of decisions made by powerful actors. Therefore, on behalf of the Banaban human rights defender, we call on the UN and the global institutions to acknowledge climate-related harms as a form of persecution and to grant legal protections that recognize forced climate displacement as a human right issue. Justice demands recognition, accountability, and reparation for those who have already been displaced and for those whose futures are threatened. The voices of all Banaban, indigenous, and island communities facing climate immobilities must be central in shaping solutions, not ignored in favor of political convenience. Thank you.
Thank you a lot for sharing, Kuta, and especially I can see that your responses are kind of building on the top of each other. Again, when we talk about persecution that Andrea mentioned and also Kgaugelo was mentioning about also the marginalization of local systems, I mean indigenous systems, but also local systems. In a way, one you're shedding light also on your personal insights, also from more the Pacific, you're clearly also talking about this marginalization also of local system, but at the same time, the persecution which is caused, of course, by this colonial legacy of our policy and the current state of climate mobility governance, which of course leads, as you said, leads people to be encapsulated in this general term of migrants without maybe mentioning or recognizing that some of these migrants are actually forcibly displaced people by climate change or as well as other factors. So thank you also, Kuta, for sharing your insights and especially personal insights. I will give the floor to Frimpong to respond to this question as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cosimo. Yeah, so I think the other speakers had already mentioned many stuff that I initially planned to say. So I'll start from here. So in my years of research in climate mobility, one thing within the UN system that I've noticed that it limits the effectiveness and also perpetuates colonial legacies is that there's a lack of binding frameworks and enforcement for climate mobility within the UN system. So as the other speakers rightly mentioned, the 1951 Refugee Convention was Eurocentric. It focused on dealing with the aftermath of the Second World War. And in its definition of persecution, climate wasn't a factor. And another interesting thing was that in 1951, I think the only sub-Saharan African country that had been formed or gained independence was just one. Oh no, there was zero countries from sub-Saharan Africa which had gained independence. It wasn't until 1957 that Ghana, my country, gained independence, and so we were not part of the discussions. But one thing that I found interesting is that in the 2000s and from the late 1990s, there had been discussions on climate mobility and being incorporated into UN frameworks. For example, the Global Compact for Migrants and Refugees has been in place. The Sendai framework, even though it doesn't explicitly address climate mobility, but implicitly, it also tackles some issues related to climate mobility. But one issue I noticed in all these frameworks is that they lack that binding force. So all these are non-binding conventions. And so both countries in the global north and the global south can choose not to implement them. And so it depends on the goodwill. They can choose to implement the measures to support people moving in the context of climate change, or they can choose not to, and there'll be no consequences. And so I think that's one issue that needs attention. And if a continuous slide, we may not be able to make headways there. And yeah, so as I mentioned, the other point that I wanted to talk about had already mentioned, so I'll just pause here and we can move on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you also to you, Frimpong, and also to respond to this question, and also to shed light on your in the case of South Africa, but also in the case of, I think it's very good when you talk about this lack of binding force. I think it explains very well actually the situation. Also, when we talk about persecution, and especially acknowledge, as also has been mentioned by the other speakers, how the view of persecution and the way it's defined is still nowadays a Eurocentric, of course. Because of lack of time, I will quickly move on to the second question. So the second question would actually reflect on a different point of view. I would like to ask you, how can we create systems that meaningfully include young people in decision making, rather than limiting them to symbolic or tokenistic roles to shape climate mobility policies that promote justice for both current and future generations? And again, I will give the floor to Kgaugelo.
Thank you so much. Very good inputs at this point. So thank you to the speakers. I will summarize this in 3 very short points. The first thing is that we need to institutionalize youth representation in policymaking. And how this manifests, you may ask, because we always say we need to institutionalize youth representation, is that we actually need to get serious and intentional about creating formal mechanisms that enable young people to hold voting power, real voting power, and shared decision-making roles. So it needs to be really embedded in the institutions, in national delegations, for conferences, forums, boards, funding boards, etc. But also in national climate-related decision-making ministries, we really need to have young people be part of the policy-making process and co-design solutions for it. The second point is that we need to support young people with resources and capacity building. For so long, young people, especially young people from the global south and marginalized communities, especially island communities, have not had enough resources, whether it be financial resources, institutional support, and technical resources to really meaningfully engage in their local communities, but also within their local ministries or governments, for example. And what this has created is a sort of elitism in youth representation. And this is a very dangerous case that we have because we have a lot of young people that are in global forums, that are in decision-making boards and mechanisms, but it has created a system and a dynamic that is just to tick a box. And that should not be the case. So we really need to counter these kinds of things, especially because in these forums, we have young people that are leading, but most of them are not from the global south. The third thing is a challenge for young people. First is that I think as young people, we need to redefine and reimagine how we see ourselves. I think oftentimes as young people, we see ourselves as receivers, as beneficiaries sometimes, and victims of the system. But it's very little that we talk about how much power we hold as a young people of the world, because I see young people as architects and perhaps even the creators of transformative systems. I think that we as young people across the world are already creating these systems. We are already engineering alternative governance models, and we're already organizing ourselves. And we need to leverage that power because it's one that can be taken away with age, right? But also with experience. So I think that we need to leverage our networks of solidarity, our climate justice coalitions, our grassroots movements. And I think that we should envision and use that to re-envision how we view youth inclusion. Because we just want to be brought to the table, give us a seat at the table. But I think that we have called for this for so long. It's worked in some cases and more cases not. And we need to start redesigning the table. We need to completely cause destruction in this process and create our own tables. Because essentially you cannot change a system without interrupting and working on the sidelines and really pushing to bring change, especially in our communities, because for how long will we wait to be receivers of change when we can begin as we are? I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Kgaugelo, a lot for your insights, and especially very important when you mention the importance of institutionalizing youth in policymaking in order to, of course, to see us as more architects of today's society, as you mentioned, but not only as tokens of today's society. And especially very interesting this aspect of also reflecting on co-designing how you can co-design also together and have an actual voice and power of voting also on a ministry level, and not only see us as to a certain extent like tokens that can have a voice, but at the same time, this voice is often not implemented within decision making, as we often notice. So I will just also give the floor now to Andrea to respond to the same question. Thank you again.
This one I took some notes prior to coming in here today and seemed almost one of the easiest, but one of the hardest things at the same time. And that's because some of the options sound very straightforward, but I think as our last speaker was just explaining, like the embeddedness, the taking back your power piece is harder than it seems when it comes to how to actually make some of this work. Because my first thought was demand your seat at the table, which again sounds straightforward, that when it comes to youth moving through these systems, they are very much managed, bureaucratically, and some of that can be dealt with by running for office locally, becoming those people who are making the decisions. And I think that can sound, yeah, it's a very simple thing. We have democracies, we demand our space by running for office, by becoming those people, by being in local bureaucracy ourselves, right? But there's been a lack of interest, I think, from older generations to allow that in a way that would make more sense. And I feel like I'm the old lady of the group today, which is fine. Because I think from that perspective, I can see that resistance over time, that there's been a consistent concern and organization, more so on the protest level to push for change from global youth, and the older folks at the table saying, yeah, they're just kids, they're just talking. And in some ways, especially, that is a really paternalistic way of handling things, considering every youth member who's ever been to the COP or any other organization trying to have their seat at the table, um, in getting deferred, oh, it's fine. It sort of misses the point that those who are sitting there don't have the future in this mess, right? That everyone else does who is younger and looking into it and thinking, how do I make this happen? And so I think there has to be a much greater, I guess, demand in that making your own space it's not negotiable. That, okay, well, if they'll let us in, no. Like, this isn't about letting anyone in as much as demanding that space in any way you can find it, because of the fact that it is a longer term issue for anyone who's young. And the longer that I teach about this when I have students, I get more of a resigned sadness than a sense of demand and anger. I mean, be angry, be just rageful. And honestly, that's useful because you have to have that fire if you're going to fight for something. And when I see lack of things being done and a lack of young people involved, you guys have numbers. There are so many more of you than there are the older folks. But I agree with our first speaker with just lacking resources. I don't want anyone to feel like you don't have the training or the knowledge to do some of these things. And I say that because prior to doing all of my academic and climate work, I used to work in politics in the US. I was a political fundraiser. I did everything from county commissions up to presidencies. And let me tell you what, these elected folks don't have anything on you because most of them are not that bright. I've worked with some really not great and not bright politicians over my years. I did this for 12 years. And they don't have anything on you. They don't have better ideas. They're not smarter. They wanted it more and they had more ambition to it. And I don't think the youth has the same kind of ambition because I think you look at it more globally. It's not just about you, it's about everyone. And in some ways, being um, politically astute is more about how you can manage yourself. So I guess as I'm passing on the torch here to the next speaker, you have the numbers and you are no better than them. And if you demand that space and you change that space because you're in that space, then it will look like how you want it to look. So you don't have to live up to anyone's standards to be heard in a room if you've made that place through becoming one of those people that needs to be there.
Thank you a lot, Andrea, for these insights, but also to share something very personal, also because maybe among all of us, you had more experience also specifically in the field of climate mobility. But especially thank you to a certain extent, also reminding us, of course, it's a generalization. I think it's a very good and proper generalization. We don't need statistics for it, that there is this important gap that we are experiencing, right? From like the previous folks, as you say, the previous generation and the current generation. And of we need to decrease this gap, but especially we need an intergenerational shift. And I think also your answer is kind of kind of assuming also that. And thank you a lot. It was also like an advice for also us young. We're all young here, to be honest, but like definitely we're like young, and then there is young. So thank you, Andrea, for sharing. I will give the floor to Kuta to respond to the same question. Thank you to all of you for your insights. I'm very grateful so far. Thank you.
Naka, if climate mobility policies are to be just and effective, young people must be fully integrated into governance structure, not sidelined. I have created a few points in order to create a system that truly includes young people in decision making. Here are the few points. Number one is a shift from consultation to co-governance. Number two, recognize lived expertise. Number three, provide resources, as mentioned from my other speakers, for meaningful participation. Number four is ensure integrational accountability. The next point is decolonize decision-making processes. The age of climate mobility demands leaders that is diverse intergenerational, and deeply committed to justice. Young people have long been at the forefront of climate movement, yet they are still denied the authority to lead formal policy making spaces. And we all know that. We've been to COP, we've been to COI, we are always denied. We are always given a limited numbers. So yes, young people, breaking this cycle means recognizing them as equal architects of change, not as a symbolic participant. So yes, true justice in climate mobility means empowering young leaders of today, not waiting for them to inherit a crisis they had no say in preventing. Therefore, let the story that I've said, or the Banaben story, be an example to all indigenous around the globe. Vinaka.
Thank you a lot also to you, Kuta, for your insights. And I think we already have another piece of advice also from you, from consultation to co-governance. I think it's beautiful advice also in this case. We always hear this word consultation. I heard the word consultation and I've been a consultant already, but I think of course we also like to implement an actual change. So thank you for another advice to you too. I will just give the floor to Frimpong also because of a lack of time. And feel free to go from whenever you want. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity again. Yeah, so very insightful inputs from the other speakers. And I'll just add 2 points to what had already been discussed. So first, I will talk about improving accessibility to research, process, publications, and also policy making processes for young people. And since I'm from Sub-Saharan Africa, I will speak from our perspective. So I think last week I came across some statistics, and I learned that African countries account for 2.8% of the global Schengen visa applications in 2023. But African countries constitute 50% of the applications that were rejected. Let me repeat, African countries constitute 50% of applications for Schengen visas that were rejected in 2023. And here's the point that I want to make. As we all know, most of the conferences and summits related to global climate policy making and stuff like that are held in places within the global north, in New York, in Paris, in Europe, and other places in the global north. But here's the challenge that many people from Africa find it very difficult to get a Schengen visa, temporary visa, to travel to these places to take part in these processes. And so their voices will not be included in such decisions. So I think that's one problem that needs to be addressed, maybe by organizing more of these programs in Africa, and also improving accessibility for young people to take part in these conferences if they are organized outside Africa. I think this can go a long way in helping young people have a voice, have a say, and that can impact these policies. And then another point that I will also mention, also it relates to monitoring. So I think one way to improve the inclusion of young people in decision making is to have some sort of system that monitors how the performance or the inclusion of young people in these processes. For example, the Global Compact for the Global Compact for migrants and refugees. I think it would be helpful if you have some sort of system organization that monitors how young people are able to participate in these, and then we can track and make improvement. I think that can also go a long way in helping. So I think that's it for me. So 2 points. One, improving accessibility to the conferences and the summits where these decisions are being made for people from the global south, like sub-Saharan African countries, and also monitoring the inclusion of young people in decision making. I think this can go a long way in making a difference. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Frimpong, also for your insights and especially speaking more in general about Sub-Saharan Africa, but especially raising two important points. And I think especially when we talk about this importance of when we hear all these conferences, especially from the global north, coming from the global north, and even when these conferences, more intergovernmental organizations or conferences are focusing in the global south, there is still a strong colonial legacy and strong decision making from the global north that is shaping, of course, all decision making. So imagine when we actually try to include the youth, which is a specific and marginal voice, not only from the global south point of view. So it's like, thank you so much for mentioning this, and especially I really like the term when you talk about monitoring, because it's so much different than tokenism. It seems like a form of co-creation also in decision making. Especially, I think it's a good idea also when you mention the Global Compact for Migration and Refugees. Well, it will be if we would actually implement more monitoring roles and actually decision-making roles of youth within these organizations and spaces. Thank you a lot also to you, Frimpong, for sharing. I will just quickly move on to the last question. Maybe I would ask the speaker to maybe be a bit more just concise, because there will be more time maybe for some questions. If we can just be a bit more concise with this one. But thank you so much for all your insights. I will read it out loud. So in this case, how can we rethink climate mobility governance by engaging with knowledge systems to recognize mobility as a long-standing cultural practice while challenging dominant Western resilience frameworks that reinforce unequal power dynamics? So I will give the floor to Kgaugelo also in this case, and thank you all for your insights so far.
Thank you so much for your question. I think that I have 3 points to address this. The first point is that we need to realize that climate mobility has been a long form of resilience, especially among marginalized communities and local communities. And I think instead of us thinking that we have all the solutions and that we are more intelligent than those who are affected, we need to really allow communities, humble ourselves, sit down with communities and learn from them. All right, those indigenous systems and local systems that I spoke about are not new. They go generations back. So I think that especially when it comes to pastoral communities, for example, in East Africa, Pacific Islanders as well, nomadic people of the world, they demonstrate that we really, really don't have any idea of what mobility practices look like in reality. They have very, very sophisticated practices that respond to climate change, but also maintain their cultural continuity and their own social cohesion. And I think that's another part that we need to really consider, is that these systems are designed to be proactive. These communities know how to be proactive and are very much aware of patterns of climate change and the weather. I think that we often in the West have a very, not me, I'm not in the West, but the West has a very responsive and reactive approach. And I think that we need to go back to the communities because they are more proactive to adapt more than we think. The second point is that we need to re-envision, go back to the drawing board, re-envision what climate governance looks like, especially as a local process, one that diverts from the traditional top-down processes we know of. And what does this entail? It means that we need to invest in translocal governance models where communities co-design how to relocate, how to adapt, but also strategies on how to adapt, right? And we have to empower, this means that we have to empower communities to articulate what this looks like on their own terms. And the other thing as well, this is an approach that I think moves away from the logic of statehood, because everything we know within climate governance is centered on the state. It's centered on borders. It's centered on what is up there as opposed to who is affected, right? So I think we need to engage with those ontologies and see mobility in a different light, especially climate governance in particular. The third thing that I would lastly emphasize is that we need to move away from Western approaches of collecting data, because oftentimes, even for me as a researcher, we, there is a prioritization of a type of way of collecting data that prioritizes quantitative and sometimes even qualitative, but in a framing that often does not cater for the experiences of people on the ground. So what we need to do is that we need to integrate storytelling in a way that speaks directly the language of those who are affected, that has a cultural understanding, a historic and spiritual understanding of mobility and climate change. And this is something that isn't embedded in policy, but we need to do that. And we need to count it as evidence, especially in how we understand climate and how we produce research and knowledge on climate change, not just in policy, but in research, in the media, and abroad. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for these insights, and especially I'm your age. And to me, hearing something so beautifully said and also so logical at the same time, that it doesn't seem logical at the same time to people to actually ask these questions, and especially from the West, these resilient frameworks, as you said very clearly, Kgaugelo, when you talk about responsive and reactive responses. It's very common in the West. We don't ask questions such as, what about your culture? What about actually like your emotional state? This is something that in my case I learned from indigenous scholars, something that maybe I don't also come genuinely to ask in a disaster situation, but this is also the basis, like our emotions, and we forget, especially from the West, to ask these more basic and logical questions. So thank you so much for emphasizing, and especially to implement this approach of, what about if we implement storytelling, and challenge also our data collection. Like, very beautiful said. I will give the floor quickly just to Andrea because of the lack of time.
Sure, I think that was a good segue into this. In my note taking prior to coming in today, like I gave some thought to the differences of what how different peoples understand mobility in the first place for knowledge systems. And I think calling it sophisticated practices makes sense for understanding how folks who are non-Western have had a historical view of this. But the way I was thinking about is, how do I contextualize our problem? Like, where do we start from this Western way of thinking about it? And it's that Western mobility is about privilege. And if we don't recognize that, we're missing, I guess, what we're fighting against for change, in that so much of Western mobility is about power, because there's power in being able to move. That historically, the West, coming out of imperialism, we're getting land and making yourself something permanent was the goal. So there's less of an emphasis on any sort of cultural mobility, as much as getting your space and kind of like staking your claim to it. And in thinking about that, you have this idea that travel or having multiple houses, like this is how a lot of Westerners view mobility. So they're coming from this space of not realizing that historically movement with seasons, with different reasons for doing this is not even in their brains. So part of like the what are you running up against in terms of cultural practices is unfortunately having to educate, which is a big endeavor, and it shouldn't be the Global South's job to do that. But it's what you run into of realizing that that's the difficulty, because the normalization of mobility is in many places is just, it's lost on a lot of Western minds. And so, but we're in this really great moment of opportunity, right? Because the West is kind of coming up with this slowly through the idea of virtual offices, right? They don't want to be tied to place in the same way we've had in the past. So we have new ideas in terms of trying to come up with the virtual space and what kind of cities we want to live in and where we want to go, and the digital nomads, as much as that's another sort of colonizing issue per se. But like, it's waking people up, I think, to the idea that the way you have built your capitalist, systems is not suited to you either, when you notice that there could be another way to do things. So to me, recognizing mobility as a longstanding cultural practice is something to have to not just integrate, but I think slowly the West is starting to see this, or at least Western workers, that this doesn't work for them either. So that pushing against this version of capitalism, I think, has some headway in how the rest of formerly colonized people can discuss it, because I think there are big cracks in how elevated this particular form of capitalism has been, and how it's not really serving people, such that they feel, I guess, culturally lacking, and realizing that we could all have better options if we're actually pushing back clearly against these systems that reinforce this, you have to do things a certain way to have power, versus how you live, in a not just a mobile, but a way of reciprocity starts to change the system anyway. I've learned so much getting a chance to live in a lot of places that most people never get to, in across the Indian Ocean and Pacific. And the reality is it feels better anyway. Just those connections and how people consider their sense of place. And the sense of place, I think in most developed Western worlds, it feels very sterile and feels very power laden instead of something that has a richness. So I'll leave that there.
Also, in your case, Andrea, thank you so much, and very beautiful said in a sad way when you talk about Western mobility. Not only and it's good that you say not only Western climate mobility, but just like Western mobility in general holds a form of power. And of course, like I think we can just simply see it in the language that we use. When a Western person, especially like an higher skill migrant, moves or like is mobile, is directly considered an expat, because migration still holds upon this derogatory term, while we don't acknowledge how most of us, privileged or less privileged, might experience before or later a form of migration, right? So thank you, and beautiful, well said when you talk about beautiful, but like well said when you talk about Western mobility as a form of power. I will give the floor immediately to Kuta because of lack of time. Well, thank you again.
Naka, I just have 2 points to highlight, and I would say a short story to tell. So the first point is support its documentation in practice. The second one is support communities in terms of practice. So you support the document, and that document will also support the communities. And here goes my short story, I would say. It's a fact though. For my Banaban people, mobility has never been merely a response to crisis. It is deeply embedded in our cultural existence. Long before colonial displacement, we navigate our environment through adaptive movement, shaping relationship across the Pacific with practice rooted in reciprocate and ecological stewardship. Yet, when climate mobility is governed through dominant Western resilience framework, it reinforces power structures that obscure indigenous knowledge systems while dictating solutions that fails to address historical injustice. To rethink climate mobility governance, we must first acknowledge how colonial histories have shaped forced displacement. Banabans were uprooted from their ancestral homeland due to extractive industries that stripped Banaba of its resources, rendering the island uninhabitable. Our forced relocation was not framed as injustice, it was rationalized under foreign government structures that prioritize profit over people. This same logic persists in today's climate mobility framework, where resilience is often defined through state-centric approach that demand education without accountability. A more approach to climate mobility must engage with knowledge systems that recognize movement as both cultural practices and survival strategies, not simply as an emergency response. For Banabans and other displaced communities, mobility is tied to kinship, land stewardship, and sovereignty. Governance structure should integrate these lived realities rather than imposed policies that treat displacement as a matter of numbers and logistics, detached from the histories and identities of those affected. Challenges dominated Western resilience models require dismantling the narrative that frames displaced communities the passive recipient of aid or adaptation policies. Instead of forcing communities into rigid framework of climate migration, governance must shift power towards indigenous and frontline voices, ensuring that mobility is not managed solely through vertical process, but through self-determined solution shaped by those experiencing it impact at first hand. For Barnabans, recognition, reinstitution, and decision-making authority are essential. Climate mobility governance must go beyond addressing future displacement. It must confront the legacy of past forced migration and ensure just for those already displaced. Barnaban leadership and knowledge must be central to climate mobility discussion, guiding policies that uphold sovereignty rather than perpetuating depending on systems that historically failed us. To truly rethink climate mobility governance, we must ensure that indigenous mobility practices are valued not as historical artifacts, but as foundation framework for climate justice today. The Pacific mobility tradition reflects resilience beyond Western definition. They embody collective survival, cultural continuity, and self-determination. The voice of displacement community must lead, not follow, in shaping the future of climate mobility governance. Let me remind us all that in Fiji, my uncle from Solomon Island were victims of blackbirding. My cousins from India are descendants of an indentured laborers. And these are a few of the many injustice stories of the people from my Pacific. Vinaka.
Thank you a lot, Kut, again, for sharing also these personal insights. And especially also thank you to you to emphasize again and reinforce this aspect of resilient frameworks as being state-centric. And of course, these frameworks, they oftentimes, as you said, like profit more the benefit of the state rather than actually profits and focus on the human rights and the needs of climate affected and not only climate affected people. And I think especially when we talk about adaptation practices, as you were talking about, which can be also coping mechanism, not only adaptation practices, these are often obscure within these frameworks because these resilient frameworks often focus on victimizing and to a certain extent also romanticizing, especially when they're led from the West, instead of actually acknowledging also the agency of climate affected people. So thank you so much also for bringing these important insights. I will just give the floor now to Frimpong to respond to the last question. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you again, Cosimo. And yeah, thank you also to the other speakers. I've been learning a lot from you guys. Yeah, and so I remember Cosimo, when you were summarizing, you mentioned something about the use of words, like how Western migrants are called expats, but we have a different term when the migrants are coming from the global south. So first, I'll talk about our discourses. So if we are to rethink climate mobility governance by engaging with knowledge systems that recognize mobility as a long-standing cultural practice, I think we need to first have a look at the discourse that we use and also the ideologies and the theories that underpin this discourse. So one is that I think for most of the media and until the mid 2000s, most of the discourses had been driven by the alarmist perspective of climate mobility. So the alarmists view people as somehow passive or people who don't have agency to the extent that every environmental disturbance will lead to displacement, will lead to migration. And so in the media, whenever climate change and mobility is discussed, many people tend to think of the fact that there's a huge number of people who will be coming to our borders to like an invasion and stuff like that. I think we need to reframe the way we put out some of these conversations, because I think number one, we need to recognize that migration is not always a problem to be solved. It can also be an opportunity for adaptation. And two, it's not always the case that every environmental disturbance will lead to migration. For example, Sub-Saharan Africa is one of the hardest hit by climate change, but at the same time, we are the least migratory region in the world. And so I think we need to consider how we frame some of these things, and also look into the local context, because if we only look at the environment, the alarmist perspective, we are likely to depoliticize the issue of migration. So let me use an example to explain this point. So for example, in my research, I look into the human mobility patterns in West Africa. And I realized that in northern part of West Africa, it's very dry, but in the southern part, there's a lot of rain, forests, and better ecology for farming. And so what I saw was that there are some pastoralists in the northern part of West Africa who would move to the south during the dry season. And then when the dry season is over, they'll move to the north. And so this kind of movement existed way before climate change became very problematic. But now, and also I also look into some mobility systems within Ghana, and I realized that many migrations in Ghana tend to happen from the north to the south, and this originates from colonial decisions. So during colonialism, the colonial powers favored development in the south, and so the northern part of the country lagged behind. And so now, even though there are some environmental factors that are driving the migration, but the root cause of the migration can be traced to the colonial era. So the point I want to make is that we need to be careful in the words that we use, so that we don't depoliticize climate mobility, because some of these people may be moving as a result of environmental factors, but that movement could be traced to certain political or colonial decisions of the past. And if these are not taken into consideration, all the policies and the governance may not be as effective as we want them to be. So for me, the point I emphasize here is we need to be careful of our discourse and how we frame a migration. We shouldn't frame people from the global south as people who are passive, but we should see them as people who have agencies. They can choose to migrate or not to migrate, and then look into how we can support them in what they are doing. And so usually when we talk of participation, we only think of how people from the global south or the locals here can participate in the international governance process. But I think we should also start thinking of how the actors at the international level can also participate in what we are doing, how they could also bring support to what we are also doing here. Thank you.
Thank you a lot, Frimpong, also in your case, and especially for bringing more insights from, also in this case, Ghana, and talking about also how important is to frame migration and be also cautious with the wording that we use, and especially to step away from often framing migrations from the global south, especially as passive. And as you well said, also in this case, in this specific webinar, we have a lot of advices. As you also say, migration is not only a problem to be solved. We also have to look at we have to step away from this victimization process of seeing migration and migrants in general as passive, as you mentioned. So thank you a lot also from your insights. We have a few minutes for some questions for the participants or for the audience. So if you have maybe this 7 minutes for a super quick Q&A session. Thank you again for all our 4 amazing speakers. On my personal case, but also I believe from the rest of MYCP team and the participants. We learn a lot from you. It was also beautiful to see how much you've been able to also compensate each other's response, not even on purpose. So beautifully well done. And thank you again for your help. I can see, I don't know if someone would like to raise their hand to ask any question. Otherwise, feel free also to text any questions in the chat, and I can read them out loud.
Cosimo, somebody texted me privately, and they I'm gonna just share in the chat the question for you. So they basically asked what stories or experiences from your communities reveal the gaps in current international protections for those displaced by climate change.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Steph. And if any of the four speakers would like to respond or start giving a response, that would be amazing. In case the question is also clear. Thank you.
Giving this a little thought, I think one of the biggest, and again, being the probably oldest member of the group here, giving the perspective of time, I think the whole international protections dialogue and discourse comes from a very sort of colonial place of I guess maybe the idea of white saviorism, like all this stuff's happening, what am I going to do about it? Well, it's not always your responsibility. And I think early on, and there's a lot of academic writing from people with very good intentions, but who've never been to communities and have written from someone else's writing, from someone else's experience who isn't local. So I think even for myself, it took me years from that standpoint of to have the funding and the energy and the time to get the experience in communities to then realize that it's not really for me to solve, because the people who are working on these things in communities have a longer history of understanding their world at a much higher level than I am ever going to understand it. And so I think one of the biggest gaps is really the idea that the bureaucratic outsider standpoint is the way in which we move change to begin with, because the local displacements in many places are things that are not always well funded in ways that they need to be, but the understanding of what needs to be done and what people really want is there if we listen instead of taking in our own thoughts of how we think something should be managed or protected. That needs to come from those who are already there, and they already know what it's a matter of asking.
Thank you a lot, Andrea, for your response. And also well said, it's a matter of asking. Sometimes we just intervene without actually thinking before and about the needs of actually the people that are actually displaced, especially when we are not the people that are maybe locally displaced in that specific context, but we still oftentimes, and speaking maybe from us, it's more like a Western point of view, we often have like the solution, while sometimes we just have to ask before actually thinking about a more collective solution. I see. Thank you for your response again, Andrea. We have another question, so maybe we can move on to the next question, and one of the other three speakers would like to respond if they want. The question is from Luis Shibi, who asks, how do language and definitions used by global institutions shape whose suffering is recognized or ignored in climate-related migration and displacement? I don't know if either Kgaugelo, Kuta, or Frimpong would like to respond. Just maybe give yourself a few seconds to also read the question again if it's clear. If you want to go, feel free to go, any of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cosimo. I will take a jab at it very shortly, briefly. I would say that in multilateral institutions, oftentimes language and definitions on these concepts is quite limited, in my opinion. If anything, I think that framing is very important, but beyond framing, the language that is used in key policy decisions is added sort of as a sprinkle on key policies that are already made. Structurally, in policy, there isn't enough done to really cement response on climate-related migration and displacement in particular. It is still a very underrated topic in the COPs in particular. And even if you see the key documents and decisions, very few times will you see communities being mentioned and finance being next to communities, or that's another part that I'm bringing in, right? It's that first in the frameworks, it isn't stringently mentioned that, we need to be investing in migration or climate related impacts on communities. It's often mentioned in passing, which again, it loses meaning. It's watered down language that wouldn't have any significant impact on communities. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'd like to add something to this question on how do the language and definitions used by global institutions shape whose suffering is recognized or ignored in climate-related migration displacement. I think this is a very difficult question and issue that I wrestled with in my research as part of the Africa Climate Mobility Initiative. So one thing that I realized was that it is very difficult to find or agree on a definition on who has been displaced or moved by climate change because of conceptual and empirical issues. So one, how can someone prove or justify that his mobility decision was caused by climate change? It may seem obvious, but it can be difficult to define because, for example, if there is flooding and someone is displaced, yes, that's a displacement as a result of climate, but can we say that it was as a result of climate change because climate change looks at the average over the long term? And so in Ghana, for example, I did my research. I found that there's no definition for who has been displaced by climate change, or there is not a definition there. So if let's say there's a funding or a project to address climate mobility, where is the money going? How are you going to designate the institution that will be working on this? Because there's no consensus on this definition. So I think that's also challenging because it's quite hard to define who falls under climate displacement or climate migration and stuff like that.
Thank you to both of you for your responses, Kgaugelo and Frimpong. And actually, very good question. I think this is one of the first questions I ever asked myself when I started actually researching in this field. And I was researching more on forced displacement in the context of climate change. And a lot of times I was asking myself, are we actually talking about forced displacement? Is there like a voluntary choice we need to actually reflect on? And maybe to what extent is it actually displacement? I think sometimes that's why it's a bit blurred. Sometimes also the knowledge on this topic revolving around climate migration and climate displacement, also because there is still not clarity on a definition level when we talk about, especially what is defined, also what has been mentioned by all of you on an intergovernmental organization level, we still have unclarity on the definitions, and especially we still use more like a Western linked language in these regards. That's why it's difficult sometimes to understand if we're talking about climate-related displacement, migration, or is it climate, but what are also the other factors in this case involved? So thank you a lot for your insights. I see that we have a couple of minutes. So in case Kuta doesn't want to just share something super quickly, or if he has some pressing issues to say, since it's the only one that didn't have the time to respond. Otherwise, I will just briefly close with a closing statement and thank you for your time. So I don't know if Kuta, you have any pressing sentences you would like to mention.
I'll respond to the two questions. For the first question, what story or experience? Basically, personally, I would say it doesn't feel right to be in a country, to be in an island that doesn't really belongs to you. Ocean Island, or also known as Banapa and Rambi, it's so far from each other. One is within the Kiribati governance, and the other is within the Fijian governance. So there's a lot of struggle. And imagine this year on 15 December, it will be our 80th anniversary. Our people have been fighting. I never mentioned that we also did the UPR submission to the UN was submitted in Geneva. And to answer the second question, how do language and definitions used by global institutes shapes whose suffering is recognized or ignored in climate-related migration and displacement, I would want to highlight one point. When the Bonobon when the island Banab has been discovered that it was rich in phosphate, so the traders, what they did is that they convert the Bible into the Kiribati dialect, which is not our indigenous dialect, the Banabans. So that was where we lost our language, our mother tongue, which is, it's very hard to accept the fact and reality. So we usually have a kind of conflict with the Kiribati community, and we know that we are different. And stating the fact that we need the Fijian passport, and then we have to lobby for the Kiribati passport, are the effects of what have been happening from 1945 till 2025. Nothing has changed in terms of policy. So it's a very heartbreaking story to share. But yes, Vinaka.
Yeah, thank you to you a lot, Kuta. And I appreciate that you shared a lot of insights also from the Pacific and also like the conflict, internal conflicts, and also the history behind. And we really appreciate it because oftentimes this information is often obscured and coming from the West, I can tell you that this unfortunately is often obscured. And I think you're not surprised also about that. So I would like, of course, to thank you, Kuta, but also thank the rest of the speakers, as well as Kgaugelo, Andrea, and Frimpong for the incredible insights. I think we had four amazing speakers that come from different backgrounds, all experts in climate mobility, but all people that critically want to address this topic and freely and transparently also talk about their own perspective and personal experiences. So again, thank you to all of you for participating and especially participating voluntarily. I think this is, of course, for the people that have the chance to participate in the webinar series. What we do at MYCP is pretty much volunteer work, so we really do it out of passion. And so I would also like to, since it's the last webinar, I would also like to thank the rest of my team, of the climate mobility team. I see Stephanie is here, but also the rest of the team who has been part also in shaping also this webinar series. We start months ago, before actually we start with the webinar series, we had the chance to collaborate with the organization Beyond Climate Collaborative to do our first ever webinar. It was not part of the webinar series, but it was what allowed us to start reflecting on the importance to actually address more webinars and more online events to address and reflect on these decolonial approaches in the field of climate mobility. You know, oftentimes this topic is framed as a niche, a new topic, but we all know, and as you said, and also we know, especially from the indigenous and local system, climate mobility has been a long-standing issue, but also not only an issue, has also been, as also Frimpong was said, we don't only have to see migration as an issue, but as a problem. We also have to look at the adaptation and the agency of climate affected people. So I would like to, for me, it's been a very important learning experience. I'm someone who wants to research in the field of climate mobility. So I learn in every session, and especially from experts that come from, oftentimes, as we invited people not from a Western background, and I think we learn a lot from you and from each other. So I would just like to, of course, tell you that what's come next after this webinar series, the free, also the other two webinars have been already uploaded on YouTube in case you want to watch it and you didn't have the chance to watch it before. Also, this third webinar will be also uploaded on YouTube, and we will just, from MYCP and our channels, we will just briefly just mention what have been like the highlights, what we learned also out of these webinars, also to provide a short overview and summary for the people who didn't have the chance to follow all the webinars. But we also hope from the climate mobility team that we would have the chance to further collaborate in other webinar series, still focusing, of course, on the colonial approaches and justice-oriented approaches in the coming months or coming year. And I can just say, of course, to then stay tuned also for the updates from this decolonization webinar series, but especially for what comes next from the climate mobility team, but the rest also of the projects held by YCP as an organization. I think just Steph, you can show the last slide for the people that especially are not familiar with MYCP as an organization. The following one, you can just see our channels as well as our email. So feel free to contact us about any questions from our work as a climate mobility team. And feel free, of course, also to scan the website and to follow us on social media if you will need any updates from us. So thank you again for all the participants to be part also of this webinar series, and especially to our speakers and also my team for the work that we've done together.
Thank you.
I think we can end the call.
Organizing us and bringing us together, and thank you for the speakers. Good rest of the day, good evening, and good morning to everyone. Bye.